I thank you for holding these hearings and for inviting me to speak today. My name is Sandy Reider. It's S-A-N-D-Y-R-E-I-D-E-R. I'm a primary care physician in Lyndonville, Vermont, and I have been practicing clinical medicine in Vermont since I was licensed in 1971. In the interest of full disclosure, I'd like to say I'm not being paid to investigate this issue, nor did I seek it out. Rather, it found me by way of a patient that I saw a couple of years ago that I had known well for quite some time, and who in the late 2011 suddenly developed severe insomnia, headaches, nausea, ringing in the ears, difficulty concentrating, and nausea, seemingly for no reason at all. This puzzled us both for a few months before we finally came to understand that he suffered from what was then a relatively new clinical entity known as wind turbine syndrome, related in his particular case to the relatively small NPS 100 kilowatt turbine that began generating power at Topkirk Mountain in the fall of 2011. In the course of 2012, the 2012 legislative session, I described this patient in detail in testimony for the Senate Natural Resources and Healthcare Committees, as well as the Governor's Citing Commission. Since his symptoms were so typical and similar to those described by thousands of other individuals living too close to large wind turbines around the globe, I have attached the testimony and encouraged you on the board to review it for its very characteristic description of what it is that this board, I trust, hopes to mitigate by recommending more protective, sound standards for these industrial wind projects. I should add that I have seen 4 additional patients living near the large Sheffield and Lowell projects, as well as 1 individual living near another single NPS 100 kilowatt turbine in Virginia, all presented with similar, though not identical, symptoms. That there have already been so many complaints here in Vermont related to wind turbines suggests that the current noise standards may be inadequate. Either the utilities have been regularly out of compliance with the current existing standards, and Shirley Nelson's detailed daily records imply this has indeed occurred with some regularity, and or that the scientific data and studies upon which the current noise standards are based are incomplete or possibly wrong. Over the past 2 years, I've reviewed much of the relevant scientific literature, and out of my 42 years' experience in clinical medicine, respectfully offer the following observations, comments, and suggestions. Firstly, I do not doubt at all that these large turbines can and do cause serious health problems in a significant number of persons living nearby. Even though the acoustical and vestibular mechanisms behind this harm are not yet completely understood, repetitive sleep disruption is the most often cited adverse effect, and disturbed sleep and its resulting stress over time is known to cause or exacerbate cardiovascular illnesses, chronic anxiety and depression, and worsening of other pre-existing medical problems. This is, as Dr. Grass already mentioned, concerning for the most vulnerable among us, the children and the elderly, those who are naturally sensitive to sound, or prone to motion sickness or migraine headaches in particular, and as mentioned, those who are unwell to start with. The position adopted by developers of large industrial wind projects, and thus far supported by the regulatory and health agencies, has been that there is no evidence of a direct effect on health from wind turbines. rather that the claimed adverse effects, health effects, are indirect due mainly to the individual's negative attitude about wind turbines, the so-called nocebo effect, and therefore it's their fault, it's all in their heads, and so on. Not only is this incorrect, it is disingenuous. There is simply no clinical or public health justification for ignoring harm being done to individuals and communities, whether direct or indirect, on these grounds. Simply put, harm is harm, whatever the mechanism. However, good evidence for direct adverse effects has existed since the mid-1980s, when Neil Kelly headed a group of researchers under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Energy and NASA, and found conclusive evidence that adverse effects very similar to those that describe wind turbine syndrome were due primarily to very low frequency sound and so-called inaudible or infrasound. This role of infrasound was subsequently confirmed by Kelly's team under controlled laboratory conditions, and resulted in a complete redesign of turbines from the downwind trestle-mounted turbines to today's upwind-mounted turbines on a single large tower. Furthermore, he recommended protective maximum levels of this low-frequency sound. I won't repeat those, but they're written in the hard copy and also on the digital version I submitted to the board, although I didn't copy it here. It's worth noting that very often infrasound levels are higher inside a building than outside. The structure acting as a resonating chamber or amplifying the lower vibrational frequencies. Thus, measurements for low-frequency sound should be made inside the structure as well as outside. Also, low-frequency sound levels are not only building design and geometry specific, but also site-specific, as has already been mentioned, especially in a place like Vermont, where the topography and climatic conditions are so variable. There may be unacceptable indoor infrasound levels in one home, while another home over the hill may have low or undetectable levels. The wind industry's assertion that the Kelly study is irrelevant and that infrasound levels are negligible with the current newer design and may therefore be ignored is not well-founded. And more recent evidence confirms this. And there's several studies that are included in my bibliography and in the text here that you can read. The aforementioned studies were performed by independent professional acousticians not connected to the wind industry. Incidentally, the severely affected patient described in my 2012 testimonies never did perceive any audible noise, ever, from the turbine. And this is typical. The sound is often more felt than heard. Nor did he harbor any feelings, pro or con, about the installation when his problems began. Indeed, it was only several months later that he realized what was going on. Once he did, of course, then I have no doubt the nocebo effect probably started to play a role in whatever he was feeling. He has since abandoned that home and is once again sleeping soundly and feeling well. The current sound standards, based as they are on dBA-weighted acoustic measurements, gives particular weight to audible frequencies in the soundscape, but little or no weight to low sound frequencies in infrasound, particularly below 10 hertz, which comprises a significant proportion of the sound generated by large turbines. People do not hear dBA. It's a theoretical number. They hear qualitatively different sounds. Birds, insects, running water, wind in the trees, and so on. Basing noise criteria solely on this single number ignores the unique nature of sound produced by large wind turbines with their constantly changing loudness, frequency, harmonics, pitch, and impulsive quality. It is precisely these qualities that make the sound feel so intrusive and annoying, especially in quiet rural environments, especially at night in quiet rural environments, where these projects are usually located. Parenthetically, the word annoying is misleading. It implies a minor, temporary, or occasional nuisance that perhaps might be mostly ignored, rather than what it is, a repetitive stressor that can degrade one's short and long-term health and well-being, and from which there is no escape over the lifetime of the project, short of having to abandon one's home. It is worth repeating here that the current Public Service Board threshold of 45 dBA of audible sound averaged over an hour has never been proven safe or protective, and that most studies agree that audible sound should not exceed 32 to 35 decibels dBA, or 5 dBA above the normal background sound levels. This is especially important, as I said, in very quiet rural areas. This should be a maximum level and not an hourly average. Above 35 dBA, there are likely to be significantly more complaints, particularly difficulty sleeping. Before concluding, I would like to emphasize that the bulk of scientific, and by the way, there's a very good chart of predicted community reaction to wind turbine noise in quiet areas put together by Robert Rand and Stephen Ambrose, and I've included that in the printed version here. Before concluding, I would like to emphasize that the bulk of scientific evidence for adverse health effects due to industrial wind turbines comes in the form of thousands of case reports like the patient I described. One or two sporadic anecdotal cases can legitimately be viewed with a wait-and-see skepticism, but not thousands where the symptoms are so similar, along with the ease of observing exposure and measuring outcomes, wherever these projects have been built. I agree with epidemiologist Carl Phillips, who said that these case reports taken together offer the most compelling scientific evidence of serious harm. Just because the prevailing models have failed to explain observed adverse health effects does not mean they do not exist. And as he succinctly, though in my opinion a bit too harshly, concludes, the attempts to deny the evidence cannot be seen as honest scientific disagreement and represent either gross incompetence or intentional bias. I am aware that the members of the PSB bear a heavy responsibility for Vermont's overall energy future and have many other issues on their plate besides this one. Rather than presenting you with a long list of literature references, most of which would likely go unread, but they're included here just in case, I recommend a careful review of just one study in particular. Bob Thorne, an acoustician in Australia, presented an excellent and well thought out clinical study in the Australian Senate in 2011. It really does cover the waterfront, including WHO quality of life measures, audible and infrasound sound measurements, and health measures in a balanced and scientific way. His comprehensive recommendations and protective recommendations for sound criteria are reasonable, and if adopted would likely be more acceptable to neighboring communities. However, given that wind developers are these days building larger turbines atop taller towers in order to maximize power generation and profit, adoption of these safer limits would necessitate siting installations further from dwellings. A 1 to 2 kilometer setback is not nearly sufficient. Significant low-frequency sound pressure measurements have been recorded in homes 3 to 6 miles away from large projects in Australia. And I have printed out in full Dr. Thorne's recommendations, which you can see. To exclude careful, independent, well-designed studies like this one and others in a review of scientific literature that purports to be thorough is, I repeat, a serious omission. Careful consideration of these independent, well-done studies, if nothing else, should encourage regulatory agencies to adopt a much more precautionary approach to the siting of today's very big industrial wind projects in order to protect the public health. For better or for worse, in today's information age, we are perhaps too fascinated by computers and mountains of data, but truth is truth, wherever you find it, even in small places. Thank you very much.